Hello guys, and welcome back to Sleepy Battle Stories. Tonight, we ride into the rolling plains of Montana, where the grass sways gently in the wind, yet beneath its calm lies a tension as old as the land itself. This is the Battle of Little Bighorn, June 25 to 26, 1876, a confrontation between the United States Army and a coalition of Lakota, Cheyenne and Arapaho warriors, where strategy, courage and the unforgiving terrain would decide a battle that no one would forget. Imagine the morning before the fight, the river glinting under the sun, hills rising gently in the distance, soldiers marching confidently, believing their numbers and training would carry the day. Meanwhile, warriors hidden among the hills, tents and bends of the river, knowing the land and its secrets far better than their opponents. Then came the clash, gunfire echoing across valleys, horses charging, warriors appearing seemingly from nowhere, units scattered, orders lost in the chaos and the battlefield, itself seeming to swallow the confident and the cautious alike. Every ridge, every grove, every curve of the river became a place of sudden violence and decisive courage. This was not a battle of slow sieges or measured exchanges. It was a whirlwind of decisions, instincts and bravery under fire, where miscalculation could mean annihilation and intuition could mean survival. And when the smoke finally cleared, the world saw a startling truth. The land could favor those who knew it best, and history could turn on a single day of courage and consequence. So, if you love stories where strategy collides with instinct, where history is carved in dust, gunfire and bravery, leave a like and subscribe. Not for spectacle, but to remember the moments when ordinary plans met extraordinary resistance. And before we step onto the plains, tell me, where are you listening from tonight? From faraway cities or quiet homes, you are here, witnessing a battle that echoes across time. Now, let the grass ripple softly in your mind, let the distant thunder of hooves fade into memory, and let's ease into the day when courage, land, and history collided at Little Bighorn. The northern Great Plains in the spring of 1876 existed as a landscape of profound and profoundly fragile equilibrium. It was a world defined by immense horizons, a sea of grass rippling under a vault of endless sky, broken only by the dark, jagged teeth of distant mountain ranges. To the westward expanding American nation, it was often labeled the Great American Desert, a barren emptiness to be traversed, or with the discovery of gold in the Black Hills, a treasure to be excavated. But to the Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho peoples who had made it their home over generations, it was the heart of everything, a complete and self-sustaining universe. Their social order was not one of static permanence, but of elegant cyclical motion, governed by the passage of the sun, the turning of the seasons, and the epic migrations of the buffalo. Life was organized around the Tiospe, the extended family band, a mobile and democratic unit where leadership was earned through wisdom, generosity and courage, not decreed by title. Authority was fluid, consensus-driven, and deeply personal. A man's standing was woven from his deeds, his spiritual power, and his commitment to the people's welfare. This world thrived on a delicate balance of power and diplomacy. Intertribal relations were complex, marked by ancient alliances and rivalries, but the mid-19th century had seen the rise of a formidable Lakota confederacy, masters of horseborne warfare who had successfully claimed these hunting grounds from other tribes. They were not isolated primitives awaiting discovery, but a confident expanding power in their own right, having dealt from a position of strength with the United States in the 1868 Fort Laramie Treaty. That treaty, signed in good faith by Lakota leaders, like Red Cloud, had guaranteed the sanctity of the Powder River country in the Black Hills, Pahasapa, the sacred center of the Lakota world, in perpetuity. For a few brief years, a tense peace held. The Bozeman Trail was closed, the forts abandoned. The agreement created a clear, if artificial, border. To the north of the North Platte River, the land was unceded Indian territory, where the tribes could live as they chose, so long as they did not molest settlers elsewhere. It was a document born of mutual exhaustion, a line drawn in the sand by a war-weary army, and a people confident in their sovereign rights. Yet beneath this paper peace, two incompatible dreams of destiny were on a collision course. The American vision was linear, acquisitive, and divinely sanctioned, a tide of manifest destiny that saw the continent as a canvas for progress, defined by railroads, fences, towns, and private property. This vision held no conceptual space for a nomadic, communal way of life that required millions of acres for sustenance. The Lakota and Cheyenne vision was circular, spiritual, and place-specific. Their destiny was not to conquer and transform, but to live in right relationship with the world that sustained them, a world where every hill, river, and stone was imbued with story and meaning. The Black Hills were not a real estate parcel laden with gold. They were the place where the world was born, where warriors went on vision quests, and where the bones of ancestors rested. The buffalo was not merely a resource, it was a sacred relative, providing food, shelter, clothing, and spiritual identity. The very soil of the plains was a living entity, not a commodity. By 1876, the pressures threatening to shatter the 1868 peace were becoming intolerable. The discovery of gold in the Black Hills in 1874 was the fatal spark. Despite the treaty's guarantees, whispers of gold in the grassroots became a national clamour. Prospectors, defying the Army's feeble attempts to hold them back, flooded into the sacred hills like a corrosive tide. The US government, rather than honouring its sworn word, sought to purchase the hills. An offer that to the Lakota was not merely insulting but incomprehensible. How does one sell the earth's beating heart? The refusal of the Sioux to sell what was never for sale was framed in Washington and in the sensationalist Eastern press, not as the defense of a solemn agreement, but as the obstinacy of hostile savages standing in the path of national progress. The social order of the plains, which had persisted for so long in its own rhythm, was now labelled an anomaly, an obstacle. The disruption was not an accident of history, but the inevitable result of a civilization that could not conceive of a legitimate existence outside its own frame of reference. The stage was set not for a simple battle, but for a catastrophic clash of worlds where every act of preservation would be seen as aggression and every act of expansion would be cloaked in the language of destiny and peace. The air, though still clear and sharp with the scent of sage, now carried the distant, metallic tang of conflict. Into this simmering cauldron stepped the principal actors, men of profound ambition, deep conviction, and fatal contradiction. On one side was Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer, commanding the 7th U.S. Cavalry. Custer was a man forged in the crucible of the Civil War, where at 23 he had become the boy general of the Union Cavalry, a figure of dazzling courage and flamboyant style. His fame was a conscious creation. The long, curling golden hair, the velveteen uniform, the personal banner flying overhead. He was a creature of publicity, writing vivid dispatches that ensured his exploits were front-page news. Yet the peace had confined his immense energies. Stationed on the frontier, he chafed against obscurity and bureaucratic inertia. The 1876 campaign represented a return to centre stage, a chance to reclaim martial glory, secure his reputation, and, not incidentally, revive political prospects that pointed toward the White House. His ambition was a fierce, hungry flame, but it was shadowed by recent humiliation. He had testified damagingly against President Grant's brother in corruption scandals, earning the president's lasting enmity and nearly wrecking his career. This expedition was his path to redemption. He feared not the Lakota warrior, whom he profoundly underestimated, but irrelevance and political oblivion. His contradiction lay in this: a man who studied the Plains tribes with a degree of anthropological interest, who had lived among the Cheyenne, yet who remained incapable of viewing them as strategic equals or their cause as morally legitimate. To him, they were a formidable quarry, a test of his mettle, but ultimately an element to be controlled or removed by the force of American arms. Opposing him was a constellation of native leadership, embodying a different kind of authority. Sitting Bull, a Hunkpapa Lakota holy man, was not a chief in the European sense, but a Wikasa Wakan, a holy man of immense spiritual prestige. He was a thinker, a prophet, a man whose power came not from commanding others, but from interpreting the will of the Great Spirit. He had never signed the 1868 treaty, rejecting forever the premise of subjugation. His ambition was not for personal dominion, but for the preservation of his people's way of life, intact and free. His great fear was fragmentation, the slow, insidious erosion of Lakota identity through dependence on agency rations and the abandonment of sacred laws. In the winter of 1875-76, he had undergone a profound sun dance on the Rosebud River. In his ritual sacrifice, he danced until he fainted, and in a vision he saw soldiers falling upside down into the Lakota camp like grasshoppers, their hats tumbling off. This vision confirmed his faith. The Wasichu, white men, would be delivered into their hands if the people remained united and true. His contradiction was that of a spiritual leader in a time demanding political and military pragmatism. His authority was absolute in matters of the spirit, but he could not order the often fractions bands to obey. Then there was Crazy Horse, an Oglala Lakota war leader of mythic prowess and enigmatic character. Where Custer sought fame, Crazy Horse shunned it, wearing plain clothing and refusing most photographs. His power was tactical and personal, emanating from a preternatural calm in battle and an almost mystical connection to the land. He fought not for plunder or status, but as a fierce protector of the land and the vulnerable. His great fear was the contamination and confinement of reservation life, the slow death of the spirit. He carried the scars of personal tragedy, including the loss of his beloved daughter and, some say, a failed love affair, which only deepened his solitary, austere dedication to his people's defense. His contradiction was his deep-seated aversion to the white world, which made him a peerless resistor, yet perhaps limited his ability to conceive of any long-term outcome other than total victory or total defeat. Other figures filled out the drama: Major Marcus Reno and Captain Frederick Benteen, senior officers in the 7th Cavalry, both harbouring deep, corrosive resentments toward Custer. Reno, an insecure and troubled man, was haunted by allegations of cowardice from the Civil War and struggled with alcoholism. Benteen, a competent and cynical veteran, openly despised Custer for the merciless court-martial of a friend years prior. Their loyalty to their commander was brittle, conditional, and fraught with jealousy. On the native side, leaders like Gull, a formidable Hunkpapa war chief whose family would be slaughtered in the battle's opening moments, and Two Moons, a shrewd Cheyenne leader, provided the hardened military acumen to complement Sitting Bull's spiritual guidance and Crazy Horse's inspired battlefield command. Each man on both sides carried within him a tangle of personal history, ambition, fear, and principle that would, under the immense pressure of events, dictate decisions of life and death for hundreds. They were all in their own ways prisoners of their past and prophets of a future they could not fully see, riding blindly toward a rendezvous that would etch their names for better or worse into the arid soil of history. The grand campaign of 1876, conceived in the carpeted offices of Washington and the headquarters of the Division of the Missouri, was predicated on a series of fatal miscalculations and simmering, unresolved conflicts. The strategy was simple in theory, a three-pronged convergence. General Alfred Terry's column, including Custer's 7th Cavalry, would march west from Fort Abraham Lincoln in Dakota Territory. Colonel John Gibbon would move east from Fort Ellis in Montana, and General George Crook would push north from Fort Fetterman in Wyoming. Their objective was to locate the hostile bands, those refusing to report to the agencies by the government's arbitrary January 31st deadline, and either force their surrender or decisively defeat them, thereby clearing the last impediment to white settlement. It was a classic pincer movement, a textbook solution drawn on maps that showed terrain but not spirit, distances but not determination. The first, and perhaps greatest, miscalculation was one of scale and capability. The Army's intelligence, derived from agents and scouts with limited understanding of the northern plains, vastly underestimated the number of Lakota and Cheyenne who had left the reservations that spring. The government believed it was hunting scattered bands of a few hundred recalcitrant warriors. In reality, Sitting Bull's call for a great gathering to discuss the threat of the Wasichu had resonated across the agencies, drawn by his spiritual authority, by the promise of one last great buffalo hunt, and by a shared desperation to live freely. Thousands were flowing into the Powder River, Rosebud, and Little Bighorn country. This was not a nomadic raiding party. It was a moving city, a Teton one, a great encampment of the Lakota, perhaps the largest ever assembled on the northern plains, containing as many as 7,000 to 8,000 people, including 1,500 to 2,000 seasoned warriors. The army columns, by contrast, were small, slow, and tethered to cumbersome supply trains. Terry and Gibbon commanded mixed forces of infantry and cavalry, plodding at a walking pace. Only Custer's 7th Cavalry, with over 600 officers and men, possessed the mobility to strike quickly, but it was a lone regiment operating on the assumption it would face a manageable foe. Within the 7th itself, hidden tensions festered like a slow infection. The rivalry between Custer and Benteen was an open secret, a cold war of muttered insults and sidelong glances. Benteen's contempt for Custer's showy tactics and personal vanity was barely concealed. Reno, as the senior captain, was the de facto second in command, but he inspired little confidence in his men or his superiors. He was a man wrestling with private demons, acutely aware of the shadow over his reputation. Custer, for his part, trusted few outside his immediate circle, particularly his loyal brother Tom, a captain in the regiment, and his brother-in-law, Lieutenant James Calhoun. This nepotism bred further resentment. The regiment was also exhausted. It had made a grueling month-long march from Fort Lincoln, covering over 300 miles in harsh weather. Horses were worn, men were tired, and the Arikara and Crow scouts upon whose eyes they depended were growing increasingly anxious, reporting signs of a massive village ahead, signs the officers, confident in their own superiority, were prone to dismiss as exaggeration. On the native side, tensions existed, as well, though of a different nature. The Great Gathering was a fragile coalition. The Lakota were divided into 7 council fires, each with its own leaders and interests. The Oglalas, Hunkpapas, Miniconjus, Sanzarks, and others had historic rivalries and disagreements. The Northern Cheyenne, fierce allies, maintained their own customs and leadership. Holding this vast assembly together required constant diplomacy, gift-giving, and the shared looming threat of the soldier columns. Young, impulsive warriors, eager for glory and horses, sometimes launched small raids at risk revealing the camp's location or provoking a premature attack. Sitting Bull and the council of headmen worked tirelessly to maintain unity, preaching patience and collective defense over individual bravado. The unresolved conflict here was between the centrifugal forces of tribal autonomy and the centripetal force of a common existential threat. Could this unprecedented alliance hold under the shock of a direct assault? As General Terry's column joined with Gibbon's on the Yellowstone River in early June, and as Crook's column, unbeknownst to them, was already checked and forced to retreat after a fierce, indecisive fight on the Rosebud Creek on June 17th, the stage was narrowing. The army's plan was already unravelling, one prong blunted, the other two moving with cautious imprecision. The Native Alliance, meanwhile, had just won a significant tactical and psychological victory against Crook, bolstering their confidence in Sitting Bull's vision and their own combined strength. They had tasted success, felt the power of their unity. As the massive village shifted west toward the valley of the Greasy Grass, the Little Bighorn River, it did so with a wary but growing sense of invincibility. The hidden tensions on both sides, of mistrust, underestimation, and fragile cohesion, were like fissures in rock, waiting for the single sharp impact that would cause the entire edifice to crack apart along its fault lines. The destabilizing incident, the catalyst that shattered the precarious status quo, was not a gunshot or a charge, but a decision. It was born from a mixture of arrogance, faulty intelligence, and the irresistible lure of independent glory. On June 22nd, aboard the steamer Far West, moored at the mouth of the Rosebud Creek, General Terry formulated his final plan. Gibbon's infantry-heavy column would continue a slow march up the north bank of the Yellowstone, then turn south up the Bighorn River. Custer's 7th Cavalry would ride up the Rosebud, follow the trail of the large Indian village discovered by the scouts, and prevent its escape southward. The idea, as communicated in Terry's somewhat ambiguous written orders, was for Custer to be the hammer, driving the village north into the anvil of Gibbon's blocking force. Terry explicitly cautioned Custer to wait, to scout carefully, and not to attack if the village was found to be moving north, in which case the two columns could combine for a concerted strike. Custer, however, heard what he wanted to hear. Terry's orders contained a crucial loophole. You should conform to them, the movements of the Indians, unless you shall see sufficient reason for departing from them. For a man of Custer's temperament, this was not a restraint but an invitation. He chafed at the idea of sharing glory with Gibbon, an officer for whom he had little professional respect. He was acutely aware that his political future and perhaps his very career depended on a singular, spectacular success. Furthermore, his Crow and Arikara scouts had been bringing back alarming reports for days. Trails wider than any they had seen, the ashes of campfires that could cover a tent, pony herds that blackened the hills. On the morning of June 25th, from a high vantage point known as the Crow's Nest, his scouts peered into the distant valley of the Little Bighorn and saw a massive dark smudge against the green, a pony herd of unbelievable size, and the faint smoke of countless lodges. They told him the village was enormous, the largest any had ever seen. They begged him to wait, to approach under cover of darkness. Attack now, in broad daylight, and they would be smoked like wolves in a hole. Here, Custer's contradictions reached their climax. The man who had written of the Plains tribe's prowess now dismissed the evidence of his own eyes and the pleas of his most experienced trackers. Perhaps he feared the village would disperse, robbing him of his decisive victory. Perhaps he suspected his command might be split if Terry's column arrived. Perhaps he simply could not conceive that a force of savages, however large, could withstand the disciplined charge of the 7th Cavalry. He made his decision. They would attack immediately. He famously declared, "The largest Indian camp on the North American continent is ahead, and I am going to attack it." He divided his already outnumbered regiment into 4 battalions, a fateful fragmentation of force. He gave Reno command of 3 companies with orders to cross the river and charge the southern end of the village. Benteen was given 3 companies and sent on a wide sweep to the left to cut off any imagined escape and to scout the valley, a vague order that would have profound consequences. Captain McDougall remained with the slow pack train carrying extra ammunition. Custer himself kept 5 companies under his immediate command, intending to support Reno's attack and strike the village's heart from the north. This decision to ignore his scouts, to disregard Terry's cautious intent, to divide his command in the face of an unknown enemy of immense size, was the single action that destabilized all careful plans and forced every character into a desperate reactive scramble. It transformed a coordinated military campaign into a series of isolated, brutal confrontations. It was an act of breathtaking audacity, rooted in a cultural certainty of superiority that blinded its author to reality. As the 7th Cavalry moved out of the Wolf Mountains and into the valley of the Little Bighorn, the immense native village, perhaps 15 miles in circumference, was in a state of midday repose. Women were digging for turnips, children were playing in the river, men were resting or tending to horses. They knew soldiers were in the area. The fight with Crook a week prior had seen to that, but they felt secure in their numbers and the spiritual promise of Sitting Bull's vision. Custer's decision to attack at that moment in that manner would shatter that security and unleash a storm of violence that neither he nor his men, nor perhaps even the gathered Lakota and Cheyenne, were fully prepared to comprehend. As the dust of Custer's dividing column settled on the dusty prairie, the immediate and irreversible consequences of his decision began to unfold with the grim logic of a tragedy. Major Reno's battalion, some 140 men, forded the Little Bighorn and formed a skirmish line in the valley, advancing toward the southern end of the massive village. The sight that met them was one of terrifying grandeur. Instead of a scattering of lodges, they faced a seemingly endless sea of buffalo-hide teepees, stretching for over 3 miles along the river's winding course. The air, moments before quiet, now erupted into a cacophony of alarm, dogs barking, women calling, the high-pitched ululations rising as warriors, reacting with astonishing speed, began to stream out from the camp on their painted ponies. Reno's advance stalled, his confidence evaporating in the face of this unexpected multitude. He had expected to strike a flank, to panic a village into flight. Instead, he was at the center of a gathering hurricane. After a brief, ineffective volley from his skirmish line, Reno made his own fateful choice. Fearful of being flanked and overwhelmed, he gave the order to dismount and then, in near panic, countermanded it with a shout to mount and retreat to a stand of timber by the riverbank. This was not a tactical withdrawal, but a rout in the making. The cohesion of his command shattered as warriors, led by the ferocious Gaul whose family lay dead in the path of the attack, swarmed around them. In the chaos of a desperate crossing back over the river, the infamous Reno's retreat, men were shot from their saddles, dragged into the water and cut down as they scrambled up the steep bluffs on the far side. Discipline dissolved into a primal struggle for survival. Dozens were killed in that wild, bloody scramble. The survivors, shattered and terrified, clawed their way to the top of the bluffs, where they were momentarily safe from direct assault but utterly isolated, wounded, and low on ammunition. Simultaneously, Captain Benteen's battalion, on its wide sweep to the south, found nothing, no fleeing village, no valley to secure. He received a hastily scribbled message from Custer's adjutant, Lieutenant Cook. "Benteen, come on, big village, be quick, bring packs. P.S. Bring packs. Sick." The tone was urgent, but the direction vague. Benteen, a cautious and resentful man, did not come on with the speed the situation demanded. He consolidated his march with the slow-moving pack train, a decision that would be debated for centuries. When he finally approached the bluffs, he encountered not Custer's triumphant column, but the ragged, besieged remnants of Reno's shattered command. Reno, in a state of shock, could only gasp, "For God's sake, Benteen, halt your command and help me. I've lost half my men." The two battalions merged on the bluffs, a force of roughly 350 men, now entirely on the defensive. The pack train with its precious reserve ammunition was still some distance away, and Custer, with his 5 companies, about 210 men, he had ridden along the bluffs east of the river, parallel to Reno's doomed charge, but separated by a series of ridges and ravines. His plan, it seems, was to find a northern ford, cross the river, and strike the village's heart, creating a devastating pincer with Reno's attack. He likely heard the intense firing from Reno's engagement, perhaps misinterpreting it as a successful assault. From a high point now called Weir Peak, officers with Reno and Benteen later claimed they saw, through the dust and haze, Custer's battalion far to the north, flags flying, moving at a trot along the ridges. It was the last clear sighting by any surviving soldiers. Then Custer and his men descended out of view, into the maze of coulees and ravines that led toward the river at a place the Lakota would later call Medicine Tail Coulee. The irreversible consequence of Custer's initial decision to divide and attack was now absolute. His regiment was split into 3 irreconcilable fragments. Reno Benteen besieged on the bluffs, the pack train crawling to reach them, and Custer's own contingent, now completely isolated and cut off from any support or even communication. The native warriors, having repelled Reno's thrust, could now turn their full, undivided attention to this new, smaller threat approaching from the northeast. The fluid, reactive nature of Lakota and Cheyenne warfare allowed them to shift forces with breathtaking efficiency. Warriors from the Cheyenne Circle and the northern Lakota circles, including those led by Crazy Horse who had been preparing for battle after the initial alarm, now flowed like a deadly current across the river and up the ravines to meet Custer. The hammer had swung, but it had missed the anvil entirely, and was now, itself, exposed and alone on the anvil of 1,000 gathered warriors. The battle's first phase was over. The second, and most infamous, was about to begin in a place that would soon be known simply as Last Stand. Hill. The long tangled threads of ambition, fear, and miscalculation had woven themselves into a noose. The world of George Armstrong Custer contracted in his final hour, from the grand vista of national destiny to the immediate dust-choked confines of a barren Montana ridge. Having descended from the sightline of Weir Peak, he and his 5 companies, C, E, F, I, and L, approached the Little Bighorn River at Medicine Tail Coulee. It was here, at this shallow ford, that he likely intended to cross and deliver his crushing blow to the village's heart. What he saw instead was a scene of gathering fury. The bank opposite was no longer a peaceful camp edge, but a swirling mass of mounted warriors, hundreds strong, pouring out from the Cheyenne and Hunkpapa circles. Gall's men, having driven Reno back, were now wheeling north. From the west, crossing the river at other points, came a new and ominous force, a stream of Oglala and Cheyenne fighters, led by the legendary Crazy Horse. They had not rushed headlong into the fray, but had taken a wider, smarter route, swimming their horses across the river farther north and coming up behind the bluffs to flank Custer's right and seal off any retreat to the north and east. Custer's battalion, perhaps taking fire from the warriors massing at the ford, did not attempt a crossing. That decision, forced upon him, marked the final, fatal pivot from offensive to defensive. He turned his command north, ascending the long, rolling ridge that would become his graveyard. The tactical situation was disintegrating faster than orders could be given. The regiment was now split not just in location, but in fate. To the south, Reno and Benteen were besieged but alive. To the north, Custer's wing was being enveloped. The warriors, operating not as a monolithic army but in fluid, fast-moving bands under their own leaders, understood the terrain and the moment with a clarity that eluded the bluecoats. They used every gully, every swale, every patch of sagebrush for cover, their wiry ponies outpacing and outmaneuvering the cavalry's larger tired horses. Custer's progress along the ridge was not a frantic gallop but a controlled retreat under increasing pressure, a fighting withdrawal seeking defensible high ground. He deployed companies as rear guards, sending Captain Miles Keogh's company Yine to hold a knoll on the east, and likely ordering his brother, Captain Tom Custer, to form a skirmish line elsewhere. The battalion coalesced around the highest point, a rounded hill at the north end of the ridge. Here, the final desperate disposition was made. The horses were gathered in a rough circle, a living, trembling barricade, and the men dismounted to fight on foot. Standard cavalry doctrine for a defensive stand. But doctrine had not envisioned this. They were not facing a line of infantry, but a concentric, mobile, and rapidly tightening ring of fire. The sound was not of orderly volleys, but a continuous crackling storm of gunfire, punctuated by the shrill war cries that seemed to come from all directions at once. From the perspective of the Lakota and Cheyenne warriors, the dynamics of the fight were shifting from defense to a triumphant, vengeful hunt. The initial shock of Reno's attack had been transformed into a roaring confidence. Sitting Bull's vision of soldiers falling upside down was manifesting before their eyes. For the young men, this was the moment to count coup, to capture prized horses, to win war honors that would be sung of for generations. For older, seasoned leaders like Gall, it was a battle of annihilation, driven by a personal fury after finding his 2 wives and 3 children dead in Reno's initial charge path. He later said, "It made my heart bad. After that I killed all my enemies with the hatchet." Crazy Horse's role was that of the master tactician, his presence on the field like a cold wind, his men following his silent signals to cut off escape and apply pressure where the soldier line was weakest. The cavalrymen on the hill, many of them raw recruits or immigrants who spoke little English, now faced a primal nightmare. Their volley fire, aimed at indistinct, fast-moving targets emerging from clouds of their own powder smoke, and the thick, choking dust kicked up by thousands of hooves, grew increasingly ragged. The warriors, armed with an array of weapons from traditional bows and lances to the latest repeating Henry and Winchester rifles, poured in a devastating fire. Army carbines, single-shot Springfields were no match for this rate of fire, and the complex process of reloading, fumbling with paper cartridges, pouring powder, seating a bullet, became a death sentence in the open. The heat was blistering, the smoke acrid. Men fell, first sporadically, then in heaps. The circle of horses struck by bullets began to collapse in a chaos of screaming, thrashing animals. The orderly defensive perimeter Custer had imagined was crumbling into pockets of desperate, isolated resistance. The battle was less than an hour old, and the illusion of control, the certainty of victory that had propelled Custer from Fort Lincoln, had been utterly extinguished, replaced by the single, stark imperative of survival on a barren hill under a pitiless sun. As the defensive perimeter on Last Stand Hill imploded, the battle dissolved into a series of frantic, close-quarter horrors where strategy was irrelevant and instinct ruled. The warrior pressure was now coming in waves, not from a distance, but from within the very folds of the terrain. Ravines that seemed to offer shelter became infiltration routes. Warriors on foot, using the tall dune grass and the smoke as cover, crawled to within point-blank range. The cavalry's cohesion shattered completely. What remained was not a battalion, but clusters of men, backs to each other, firing until their ammunition was gone and then using their carbines as clubs. The company structure evaporated. It was every small group, every pair, every individual alone. The final moments are shrouded in the fog of war and the contradictory testimony of the victors, but a grim consensus emerges from later native accounts. With the horse barricade broken, warriors mounted and on foot swarmed over the hill. The fighting was hand-to-hand, brutal and total. Tom Custer, it was said, fought with legendary ferocity, his body found so mutilated it was identifiable only by a known tattoo. Adjutant Cook, with his distinctive long side whiskers, was killed near the general. Miles Keogh fell with his company on the eastern knoll. For George Armstrong Custer, the end came near the apex of the hill, surrounded by a ring of his dead. The myth of a final noble stand with a small devoted band is just that, a myth. The reality was likely more chaotic, a final few minutes of desperate pistol fire and hand-to-hand struggle before he was struck down, shot in the left, temple and the chest. The Lakota and Cheyenne, respecting a courage they themselves valued above all, did not immediately mutilate his body. He was left lying where he fell, a sign of respect for a warrior who had died fighting. Others were not so fortunate. The psychological and moral landscape of the battle in these minutes was a study in stark contrasts. For the soldiers, the experience was one of accelerating terror and disintegration. The world reduced to the deafening roar of gunfire, the screams of men and horses, the sight of friends collapsing, the metallic taste of fear. Any thought of glory or duty was erased by the base will to live. For the warriors, the emotion was a potent, rising mix of fury, exultation, and spiritual confirmation. This was not mere combat, it was the fulfillment of prophecy, the defense of home and family, the settling of a deep historical score. Each act of bravery, riding directly at the soldier line to count coup, seizing a cavalry guidon, wresting a weapon from a dying man, was a stanza in a song that would be sung that very night. The moral ambiguity that later generations would ponder was absent in the heat of the moment. This was, for them, a clean and righteous victory. On the southern bluffs, 4 miles away, the remnant of the 7th Cavalry heard a change in the tenor of the gunfire. The heavy, sustained firing from the north, which had been a continuous roar for perhaps 40 minutes, reached a crescendo, a final, intense fusillade that crackled and popped like a burning wagon load of ammunition, and then, around 4:30 p.m., it stopped. An eerie, unsettling silence descended over the northern landscape, broken only by the closer sounds of skirmishing around their own position. Lieutenant Edward Godfrey of Benteen's command later recalled the moment. A feeling of apprehension impressed us all. Captain Thomas Weir, restless and uneasy, mounted his company without orders and began riding north toward the sound of the now silent guns, drawn by a dreadful curiosity. Benteen, after a delay, followed with the rest of the command, consolidating on a high point now called Weir Peak. Through field glasses they scanned the distant ridges. They saw dust, moving groups of warriors, scattered objects on the ground that might have been bodies, but no sign of organized resistance, no flutter of the 7th's guidance. The truth, monstrous and unthinkable, began to dawn. They saw warriors stripping the dead, saw victory dances in the distance. Custer's command was gone. The shock of this realization was paralyzing. All offensive thought ceased. The sole mission now was to avoid sharing that fate. Benteen, taking charge from the shell-shocked Reno, ordered a rapid retreat back to their original hilltop position near the pack train. It was a perilous movement, pursued by exultant warriors fresh from their triumph to the north. The siege of the Reno-Benteen hilltop began in earnest as the sun started its descent. The warriors, though celebrating, maintained pressure, keeping the soldiers pinned down, sniping at any exposed movement. The soldiers dug shallow rifle pits with their knives, tin cups, and bare hands, using dead horses and packing boxes for barricades. The mood was one of sheer terror and stunned disbelief. They were surrounded, outnumbered, low on water and ammunition, and now bore the weight of a catastrophe whose full scale they could only guess at. The long, hot afternoon gave way to a tense, fearful night. On the hill, men listened to the distant sounds of victory songs and drums from the immense village below, a haunting, terrifying chorus that left no doubt as to the day's outcome. The illusions of the campaign, of easy victory, of inferior foes, of manifest destiny, had died with Custer on that ridge. What remained was the bare struggle for survival and the dawning horror of a national calamity. The night of June 25, 1876 presented two profoundly different realities separated by a few miles of darkened prairie. In the great village along the greasy grass there was an atmosphere of immense, triumphant yet sober celebration. Fires lit up the vast encampment as families feasted, exchanged stories and sang victory songs. The scalp dances were not mere revelry. They were sacred rituals of thanksgiving and power, a way to honor the spirits that had granted this victory and to transform the spiritual energy of the defeated enemy. Yet, amidst the joy, there was also grief. Warriors had been lost, perhaps 60 or 70 men, including some notable leaders like the Cheyenne chief Lame White Man and the Lakota warrior Noisy Walking. Their deaths were mourned, their bravery honored. The victory was complete, but its cost was deeply felt. For Sitting Bull, the night confirmed his spiritual authority. His vision had been true. The people had remained united and had been delivered. But the unity was fragile. A council was held. The practical, pressing question now faced them: what next? Some young men, emboldened by success, argued for wiping out the remaining soldiers on the hill the next day. Others, more pragmatic or perhaps more spiritually attuned to the nature of their victory, cautioned against it. The soldiers on the hill were dug in, armed with long-range rifles. Attacking their position would mean charging uphill into prepared defences, a different proposition altogether from the fluid, enveloping battle they had just won. Furthermore, such a large village with its immense pony herd could not stay in one place for long. The grass was being eaten down, and the sheer logistics of feeding thousands demanded movement. Most pressingly, they knew other soldier columns were in the area, Gibbon and Terry. To stay was to risk being caught stationary by a reinforced army. The decision, likely reached through consensus, was to withdraw. The victory was definitive. There was no need to risk more lives in a costly assault. They would break camp and move south toward the Bighorn Mountains to disperse and resume the summer hunt. On Reno Benteen Hill, the night was one of unmitigated horror and deepening dread. The wounded moaned and cried for water under a sky that offered no comfort. Men shivered in the sudden chill of the plains night, pressed against the foul-smelling earth of their shallow pits. Every sound from the darkness, the rustle of a grass, the distant howl of a wolf, the occasional nerve-shredding rifle shot from a warrior testing their perimeter, sent waves of panic through the exhausted ranks. Thirst became a torment. A few brave souls, like the volunteer water carriers, made suicidal crawls down a steep ravine to the river, filling canteens under the threat of instant death. The stench of dead horses and men began to hang in the air. Officers moved among the men, trying to maintain order, but the morale was shattered. Rumours flew that Custer had survived and was coming to rescue them, that the Indians were massing for a final attack at dawn. The truth they suspected, that Custer and over 200 men were dead, was too monstrous to fully accept. They were a beleaguered island in a sea of darkness, clinging to life, utterly ignorant of the council happening in the village that would decide their fate. For individuals, the strain was unbearable. Major Reno descended further into a state of paralytic shock and, some later claimed, drunkenness from a flask of whiskey. His command effectively passed to Benteen, who, for all his cynicism, displayed stubborn courage, tirelessly moving along the lines, encouraging men, directing the defence. Lieutenant Winfield Edgerly, Captain Thomas French, others. They performed their duties, but a pall of doom hung over them all. The psychological impact was unique for each man. The terror of the fresh-faced recruit from New York or Germany, the grim professionalism of the grizzled sergeant, the bewildered fear of the Arikara scout who now found himself on the wrong side of a Lakota whirlwind. They'd come as hunters, and now they were the hunted, trapped and waiting for the kill. As dawn broke on June 26th, the men on the hill braced for the final assault. To their astonishment, they saw not massing warriors, but movement of a different kind. Through their field glasses, they observed the immense village beginning to pack up. Long lines of travois were being assembled, lodge poles were being taken down, pony herds were being gathered. It was a slow, majestic, and deliberate process. Throughout the morning, warriors continued to snipe at their position, covering the village's departure. A few even staged bold, feinting charges to keep the soldiers pinned down. but the main attack never came. By mid-afternoon, the great gathering was in motion, a colossal dusty procession winding south up the valley of the Little Bighorn, disappearing into the haze and the broken landscape. The siege was over. The silence that followed was almost more terrifying than the gunfire, a vast empty silence broken only by the wind and the groans of the wounded. They were alone, atop their barren hill, surrounded by the evidence of their own ruin, saved not by their own prowess, but by the strategic decision of their enemies. The Battle of the Little Bighorn for the 7th Cavalry was over. The aftermath was about to begin. The relief column, led by General Alfred Terry and Colonel John Gibbon, approached the Little Bighorn Valley on the afternoon of June 27th with a sense of cautious optimism. They had heard distant gunfire 2 days prior, but assumed it was Custer engaging the enemy, presumably with success. Their pace was methodical, infantry paced. It was their Crow scouts who first sensed the catastrophe. They began to sing their death songs, recognizing the signs on the wind. As the column neared the battlefield, the evidence became undeniable. First, they found the naked, mutilated bodies of Reno's retreat scattered along the river bluff and in the timber. The air grew thick with the sickly sweet smell of death. Then, ascending to Reno's hilltop position, they found the survivors. Haggard, hollow-eyed men, many wounded, all shrouded in a trauma so profound it rendered them nearly mute. Captain Benteen reportedly rode out to meet Terry. When asked of Custer's whereabouts, he simply said, "To the best of my knowledge and belief, he lies on this ridge about 4 miles north of here with all his command killed." The words, delivered with the flat tone of utter exhaustion, struck Terry and his staff like a physical blow. The full, horrifying scope began to unfold as officers rode north to the ridge. What they witnessed defied comprehension and stained the memory of every man who saw it. The field was one of apocalyptic horror. Over 200 bodies, most stripped and mutilated according to the ritual practices of vengeance and spiritual empowerment, lay, scattered in a grotesque tableau across the barren hillside. They were not arranged in neat military rows, but in chaotic, telling clusters, evidence of last pockets of resistance. The heat had done its gruesome work. Bodies were bloated and blackened, often unrecognizable. Papers from pockets fluttered in the wind. Dead horses lay in heaps. The silence was absolute, broken only by the buzz of countless flies. The identification process was a nightmare. George Custer was identified by the bullet wounds and the fact that his body had been left relatively untouched save for a punctured eardrum, a ritual to allow him to hear in the next world. His brother Tom was a ghastly ruin, identifiable only by a tattoo. Boston Custer, a civilian forage master, and nephew Harry Reid were also found dead. The Army's world of order, rank, and discipline had been reduced to this charnel ground. The shock was total, national, and immediate in its transmission. On the steamer Far West, which would become a hospital ship and news-bearing vessel, the wounded were loaded, and the reporter Mark Kellogg, who had died with Custer, was found. His notes were lost, but the story was now the greatest sensation of the age. The commander of the Dakota column, General Terry, penned his official report, a document of stunning, somber clarity that tried to make military sense of the senseless. It contained the now immortal line, contextually describing Custer's division of the regiment, and I think I am right in saying that it was done without any orders from him. On the hilltop, the survivors were a broken regiment. The physical task of burying the dead was horrific. Shallow graves were scraped in the hard earth, often using knives, plates, and axes. Rocks were piled over the remains. It was a hasty, inadequate interment, a final insult in the desecration. The wounded, including about 60 men from the hilltop fight, were carefully transported on mule litters over 15 miles to the waiting Far West. Under the command of Captain Grant Marsh, the steamer would make a legendary dash down the Bighorn, Yellowstone, and Missouri rivers, covering 710 miles in 54 hours, to bring the first wounded and the dreadful news to Fort Lincoln. The social order of the frontier army had been inverted. The victorious, the confident, the symbol of national power, had been not just defeated but annihilated. The news, when it reached the outside world on July 5th, would shatter the nation's centennial celebrations. The massacre of Custer was born in that moment, a narrative frame that would dominate the American understanding of the event for a century. For the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho, the victory was the peak of their power, but the aftermath held a different tension. The great village dispersed as planned. The spiritual high of the victory was real, but pragmatic leaders knew the reaction it would provoke. They had broken the army's sword, but they had not broken its will or its limitless resources. The summer hunt continued, but with a new wariness. The unity of the gathering began to fracture as bands returned to their own territories and concerns. Sitting Bull's coalition, so potent in defense, was not a permanent nation-state. It was a moment in time. The victory at the Greasy Grass was complete, but it was not the end of the war. It was, though no one on either side could truly grasp it yet, the beginning of the end. The United States, humiliated and enraged, would now commit the full, industrialized weight of its military to a war of attrition and starvation that would end within a year on the frozen ground of Montana and in the surrendered rifles at the agencies. The triumph contained the seeds of its own tragic reversal. In the immediate wake of the battle, as the far west carried its terrible cargo downriver, the first layers of myth began to form, hardening like clay over the complex truth of the event. The survivors on the hill, Reno, Benteen, the officers and men, began the internal and external process of accounting for the disaster. Even before they reached civilization, the outlines of the story that would protect the living at the expense of the dead were being drawn. The central, unassailable fact was Custer's annihilation. The urgent, unspoken question was, who bore the blame? The official narrative, shaped by Terry's initial report and the survivors' testimony, coalesced around a few key, defensible points. Custer had attacked a vastly superior force. He had divided his regiment in the face of this enemy, and he had fallen gallantly. This served the army's need to explain a defeat without condemning its own institutional assumptions about Native American military capability. It was easier to believe in one man's tragic miscalculation than in a systemic failure or a genuine enemy superiority. Thus, the last stand myth was born, not from native accounts or forensic evidence, but from the romantic necessities of a grieving nation. Custer, the flawed, ambitious officer, was transformed into Custer, the golden-haired hero, defending his position to the last bullet, surrounded by his loyal men. Artists like Cassily Adams and Frederick Remington would soon create iconic images of this fiction, a small band of doomed troopers, back to back, facing endless waves of faceless attackers. It was a powerful, comforting image. It turned a military disaster into a tableau of heroic sacrifice, akin to the Spartans at Thermopylae. It allowed the public to mourn without having to question the righteousness of the campaign that led to the deaths. The fact that Custer had likely been killed early in the fight on the hill, that the battle was a rout and a slaughter rather than a staged epic, was buried as effectively as the bodies in their shallow graves. For the key living characters, the battle was a defining and often destroying event. Major Marcus Reno faced a court of inquiry in 1879 to investigate his conduct. He was ultimately cleared of cowardice, but the cloud never left him. Ostracized, plagued by alcoholism and scandal, he died in obscurity, a broken man forever shadowed by the taunt, Reno the coward. Frederick Benteen, his resentment now curdled by the ordeal and the subsequent lionization of Custer, spent years writing bitter defensive letters and articles, sharpening his criticisms of his dead commander. He served on, but never regained prominence. For them, the battle was a poison that contaminated the rest of their lives. For the native victors, The aftermath was a slow, grim awakening to the nature of their Pyrrhic victory. The summer of 1876 was their last season of true freedom. The U.S. Army, under generals like Crook and Nelson Miles, launched relentless winter campaigns, attacking villages in the harsh cold when the ponies were weak and the people were stationary. The strategy was one of exhaustion: destroy food supplies, burn lodges and blankets, capture pony herds. Without the buffalo, which were being systematically eradicated by hide hunters, the people faced starvation. One by one, the great leaders surrendered or were hunted down. Crazy Horse surrendered at the Red Cloud Agency in May 1877, only to be betrayed and killed months later, bayoneted while under arrest. Sitting Bull, holding out the longest, led his band to exile in Canada for 4 years, but facing starvation, returned to surrender at Fort Buford in 1881. The victory at the Little Bighorn had made them targets of a national vengeance. The free life they had fought to preserve was systematically dismantled. The battlefield itself lay silent under the wide Montana sky, a sacred site for the victors, a haunted ground for the nation that had lost there. The shallow graves were soon disturbed by scavengers and the elements. In 1877, the army returned to re-inter the officers' remains, sending Custer's bones to West Point for burial. A granite monument was later erected on Last Stand Hill, listing the names of the soldiers who died with the 7th Cavalry. For decades, the official story etched in stone was the only one told. The native perspective, the complexity of the alliance, the brilliance of their tactics, the righteousness of their cause, these were erased, relegated to the realm of savage warfare. The legacy of the battle in the immediate decades that followed was not one of understanding, but of use. It became a rallying cry for further conquest. Remember Custer. It justified the harsh policies of confinement and assimilation that followed. The shock of the defeat did not prompt introspection about broken treaties or cultural conflict. It accelerated the machinery of subjugation. The Battle of the Little Bighorn was a decisive event that permanently altered the course of the story, not by preserving native freedom, but by ensuring its final, brutal conclusion. The illusion of possible coexistence, already thin, was shattered along with the 7th Cavalry. What followed was not war, but mopping up. The great irony was complete. The most stunning Native American victory in history became the direct cause of their final, irrevocable defeat. The news of the Little Bighorn reached the outside world on July 5, 1876, just as the United States was celebrating its centennial with grand exhibitions in Philadelphia proclaiming a century of progress and national unity. The telegraph wires carried a message of such shattering contradiction that for a moment it seemed to stop the national heart. The initial reports were fragmented, hysterical. Custer massacred. No officer or man of 5 companies left to tell the tale. The public, primed by years of sensationalist dime novels and newspaper accounts of Indian depredations, received the news not as a military defeat but as a monstrous atrocity. The centennial's self-congratulatory narrative of manifest destiny was violently punctured. In its place arose a visceral need for explanation, for blame, and for vengeance. The press, acting as the nervous system of the nation, amplified the shock into a unified cry of outrage. Headlines did not speak of a battle, but of a massacre, a term loaded with connotations of innocent victims and savage butchers. The New York Herald declared it the most terrible disaster in Indian warfare. The Bismarck Tribune, closest to the scene, wrote with grim finality, "The flower of the army is dead." This rapid crystallization of the Custer massacre narrative served a crucial psychological and political function. It simplified the unbearable complexity of the event into a digestible, emotionally potent story. George Armstrong Custer, the ambitious and controversial officer, was instantly martyred. His flaws, his vanity, his recklessness, his political entanglements, were burnished away in the fire of his reported last stand. He became a symbol of American courage cut down by a treacherous, overwhelming foe. The fact that he had attacked a village in its home territory, that he was the aggressor on that day, was utterly erased. In the public imagination, he was cast as the defender, the patriot, the noble sacrifice on the altar of civilization. This myth-making was not accidental, it was necessary. To confront the truth that the US Army had been outfought and outgeneraled by the people it sought to dispossess would have required a fundamental reckoning with the nation's expansionist ideology. It was far easier and more politically useful to frame it as a tragic stumble by a hero on the inevitable march of progress. The political fallout was immediate and severe. The Grant administration, already weakened by corruption scandals, found itself under fierce attack. The Democratic press lambasted the Republican president for mismanaging Indian policy, for allowing the hostiles to gather strength. The military strategy was called into question. Yet, in a paradox that would define the response, the criticism did not lead to introspection or a change in policy objectives. Instead, it fueled a demand for overwhelming punitive force. The defeat was framed not as a reason to reconsider the legitimacy of the war, but as proof of the enemy's irredeemable savagery, thus justifying any and all measures to subdue them. Congress quickly appropriated emergency funds. Public sentiment, whipped into a fury by the press, overwhelmingly supported a war of annihilation. The phrase "Remember Custer" became less a lament and more a battle cry, a moral license for the brutal campaigns that would follow. For the US Army, the shock was profound and professional. The institution faced its greatest humiliation since the Civil War. Internally, a scramble to assign blame began, carefully orchestrated to protect the Army's honor. The official inquiries and reports would subtly shift responsibility onto Custer himself, for disobeying orders, for dividing his command, while exonerating the broader strategy and the actions of the survivors, Reno and Benteen. This allowed the Army to mourn its lost son while diagnosing his defeat as an aberration, a failure of individual judgment rather than of institutional doctrine. The notion that Lakota and Cheyenne tactical prowess could be a match for trained cavalry was a heresy that could not be entertained. Thus, the lessons learned were the wrong ones, not about respecting native military power or the perils of underestimation, but about the need for larger numbers, better intelligence, and, crucially, attacking in winter when the villages were immobile and vulnerable. The Army's wounded pride demanded a redemption that could only be written in total victory. The Little Bighorn for the American military became a sacred wound, a trauma that mandated a ruthless and complete response to restore its sense of invincibility and purpose. While the nation fashioned a myth, the survivors of the 7th Cavalry carried within them a raw, unvarnished truth, a haunting memory that refused to conform to the heroic narrative. For the soldiers who endured the siege on Reno-Benteen Hill, life after the battle was a protracted exercise in silent trauma. They returned to Fort Abraham Lincoln, not as conquering heroes, but as ghosts, stepping off the steamer into a community shrouded in mourning. The wives of the fallen, including Elizabeth Libby Custer, now a widow at 34, faced a devastation that was both personal and spectacularly public. Libby, possessing a keen intelligence and a fierce devotion to her husband's legacy, would dedicate the remainder of her long life to a single purpose: shaping and defending the Custer myth. Through her best-selling books, Boots and Saddles and Tenting on the Plains, and her relentless social campaigning, she presented an image of her Alti as a flawless Christian knight, a devoted husband and a martyr to duty. She became the guardian of the shrine, silencing critics, cultivating relationships with writers and artists, and ensuring that the popular memory of the battle remained one of heroic sacrifice against impossible odds. Her grief was genuine, but it was channeled into a powerful force that cemented a sentimentalized version of history for generations. For the enlisted men and junior officers who survived, there was no such platform. They carried the sensory horrors of the battle, the screams of dying horses, the thirst, the stench of death, the sight of comrades tumbling from saddles during the retreat, the terrifying silence after Custer's last shots. Many suffered from what would later be termed post-traumatic stress, manifesting in alcoholism, erratic behavior, and broken lives. They were expected to bear their trauma quietly, to conform to the official story, and to return to the hard, thankless duty of frontier soldiering. Their personal accounts, when given at the Reno Court of Inquiry in 1879, were legalistic and guarded, designed to protect themselves and their fellows from blame. The true, chaotic and panic-stricken reality of the retreat and the siege remained largely locked within them, a subterranean river of fear and guilt that ran counter to the official stream of heroism. The native participants, meanwhile, carried their own truths north into Canada or onto the shrinking reservations. In the immediate aftermath, their victory was a source of immense power and spiritual confirmation. But as the Army's winter campaigns took their brutal toll, the story of the Greasy Grass began to change tone. It was still a song of victory, but sung increasingly in a minor key, a remembrance of a time when the people were united and strong, a beacon against the bleak reality of surrender, hunger, and confinement. For Sitting Bull in exile in the grandmother's land, Canada, the story was a cornerstone of his dignity and a testament to his prophetic leadership. He recounted it to Canadian officials and newspaper reporters, not as a tale of massacre, but as a narrative of successful defense. For Crazy Horse, in the uneasy months before his death, the memory was likely one of tactical perfection, but overshadowed by the grim knowledge that such a victory could not be repeated against the endless resources and winter warfare strategy of the Wasichu. The battlefield itself became a palimpsest, a text written over by competing memories. The US Army reinterred the dead and erected headstones, marking the site as a military cemetery, a place of national mourning and pilgrimage for whites. For the Lakota and Cheyenne, it remained and remains sacred ground, not a cemetery of foes, but a place where the spirits of their own ancestors fought for the life of their people. It was a site of prayer and remembrance, but one many could not openly visit as the government tightened its control. Two parallel memories now existed in irreconcilable opposition, one of a heroic last stand, the other of a righteous defense of homeland. For decades, the official white memory held the field, literally and figuratively. The native memory was preserved in winter counts, in oral histories shared within families and communities, and in the private ceremonies of a people under siege. The battle had created not one history, but two, running on parallel tracks that would not meet in public discourse for 100 years. The American military response to the Little Bighorn was not a reconsideration, but an escalation, a colder, more calculated, and ultimately more devastating form of warfare. The romantic summer campaign notions that had led to Custer's defeat were discarded. In their place, Generals Philip Sheridan, William Tecumseh Sherman, and Nelson A. Miles implemented a strategy of total economic and environmental war. The objective was no longer just to defeat warrior bands in battle, but to destroy the very foundation of Plains Indian life. The key insight, long understood but now pursued with relentless vigor, was that to conquer the horse and buffalo culture, one must eliminate the buffalo and capture the horses. The winter of 1876-77 became the theatre for this new, brutal phase. While native families sought shelter in secluded valleys, the Army launched coordinated winter campaigns. The conditions were horrific for both sides, but the Army, with its supply lines and fortified posts, could sustain the effort. The people in the villages were vulnerable, their ponies were weak from scarce forage, their mobility severely limited by deep snow, pregnant women, children, and elders. On November 25, 1876, Colonel Ranald S. Mackenzie struck the village of Dull Knife's northern Cheyenne in the Bighorn Mountains. It was not a pitched battle, but a ruthless destruction. Warriors fought a desperate rearguard action as soldiers burned over 200 lodges, captured the entire pony herd, and destroyed all winter food stores and clothing. The Cheyenne, facing starvation and freezing in the sub-zero temperatures, straggled through the snow to seek shelter with crazy horses or glalas. Their power was broken. Simultaneously, the commercial slaughter of the buffalo, encouraged by the army and railroad interests, reached its genocidal peak. Hunters like Buffalo Bill Cody worked systematically, killing thousands per day for hides, leaving the carcasses to rot on the prairie. The railroad lines split the herds and provided easy transport for hides and bones. This was not merely market hunting, it was strategic policy. General Sheridan famously told the Texas legislature, when they considered protecting the buffalo, "Let them kill, skin, and sell until the buffalo is exterminated, as it is the only way to bring lasting peace and allow civilization to advance." The ecological foundation of Plains Indian life was being deliberately pulled out from under them. The great gatherings, the sustenance, the material for shelter and clothing, all were vanishing with the thunder of the herds. Nelson A. Miles emerged as the most relentless practitioner of this new warfare. Throughout the winter and spring of 1877, he used his infantry and cavalry in a relentless pursuit, leveraging his Indian scouts, often from rival tribes like the Crow and Pawnee, to track villages across the frozen landscape. He engaged in constant skirmishes, wearing down resistance, capturing pony herds and destroying camps. His strategy was one of attrition and exhaustion. He did not necessarily seek a dramatic Custer-style confrontation. He sought surrender through absolute deprivation. The psychological impact was profound. Facing the choice between watching their families starve and freeze or surrendering to the agency for government rations, often meager and corruptly distributed, band after band made the agonizing decision to come in. This period saw the end of the great leaders. In May 1877, Crazy Horse, seeing the suffering of his people, led nearly 900 Oglalas to the Red Cloud Agency near Fort Robinson, Nebraska. His surrender was a moment of profound historical pathos. He was the last great war chief in the field, a symbol of resistance, now submitting to the very confinement he had fought against. His presence made the agency authorities deeply nervous, and in a tragic confusion 4 months later, he was arrested and killed, bayoneted by a guard. Sitting Bull held out in Canada until 1881, but with his people starving and the Canadian government offering no support, he too crossed the border and surrendered. The victory at the Little Bighorn had made them the most wanted men in America, and the military's winter war ensured there would be no sanctuary. The conflict was no longer about battles, but about survival. The war for the Black Hills and the Powder River country was over. The war for existence had begun. The relentless military pressure of the winter campaigns precipitated a crisis of spirit and survival within the native camps, forcing a series of agonizing decisions that would define the future of their nations. The unity that had triumphed at the Greasy Grass fractured under the duress of starvation and cold. The debate that had followed the victory, whether to stay together or disperse, was now answered with brutal finality by the army's strategy. Families faced an impossible calculus: risk death by exposure and hunger in the freedom of the mountains, or surrender to the uncertain and often degrading mercy of the reservations. For a people whose identity was inextricably linked to autonomy and mobility, the choice was a form of spiritual death. The journey of Dull Knife's northern Cheyenne after Mackenzie's attack became an epic of suffering that illustrated this desperate crossroads. Having lost everything, they trudged through deep snow and sub-zero temperatures to seek refuge with Crazy Horse. Many froze to death. The wounded and elderly were left behind. When Crazy Horse surrendered, the Cheyenne were compelled to follow. arriving at the Red Cloud Agency exhausted and destitute. But the government's next decree presented a new horror. They were to be forcibly relocated to Indian Territory, present-day Oklahoma, a land alien to them, hot, humid, and disease-ridden, far from the sacred Black Hills. In 1878, Dull Knife and Little Wolf would lead a desperate breakout and flight north to return to their homeland, a tragic odyssey of pursuit, battle, and eventual capture that highlighted the profound disconnect between government policy and human need. The surrender of Crazy Horse was a seismic event. For his followers, it was an act of pragmatic despair to save the lives of women and children. For the US military and the Indian agents, it was the ultimate prize. Yet, they had no framework for understanding or accommodating a man of his stature and unbending spirit. He refused to be co-opted, to go to Washington on a delegation to play the role of the tame chief. His very presence at the agency was a destabilizing force, a living reminder of resistance and a focal point for discontent. The tensions culminated on September 5, 1877, when, amid confused orders and fear of a planned uprising, he was arrested. Scuffling broke out, and in the guardhouse at Fort Robinson, a soldier ran him through with a bayonet. His death under a flag of truce was not just the killing of a man, it was the symbolic extinguishing of armed resistance. The news spread across the plains with a chilling finality. Even the great Crazy Horse could not outlast the new American way of war. Sitting Bull's exile in Canada represented a different path, a stubborn holding out for terms that would allow true autonomy. For 4 years he and his band lived a precarious existence, hunting the dwindling buffalo herds north of the border. But the Canadian government, while offering sanctuary, refused to grant them a reservation or rations, insisting they were American Indians. The mounted police respected him but kept a wary distance. As the buffalo disappeared and his people grew gaunt, Sitting Bull's authority was strained by hunger. Children cried for food they did not have. The proud hunk papas were reduced to begging and eating their horses. In July 1881, with 187 starving followers, he crossed the border at Fort Buford, Montana, and surrendered to his old adversary, Major David H. Brotherton. His speech was one of defiant dignity. I wish it to be remembered that I was the last man of my tribe to surrender my rifle. I wish to look into the eyes of my children and see them grow up in this land. He handed his rifle to his young son, Crowfoot, who presented it to the major. It was a powerfully staged moment of capitulation, preserving his pride even in defeat. The Great Coalition was now fully dismantled. The victors of the Little Bighorn were prisoners of war, their freedom and their way of life irrevocably broken. With the military resistance crushed, the United States turned to the final bureaucratic phase of conquest, the legal and political confiscation of the land that had been the cause of the war. The Black Hills, the sacred Pahasapa, had never been legitimately purchased. The Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868 was still the law of the land, guaranteeing Sioux ownership. The victory at Little Bighorn paradoxically provided the impetus to simply tear up the treaty. In 1877, Congress passed the Sell or Starve Act, also known as the Agreement of 1877. This legislation unilaterally abrogated the 1868 treaty and seized the Black Hills, along with much of the remaining unceded hunting territory. It was not a negotiation with the Sioux, it was a dictate. The tribes were given an ultimatum: cede the hills or all government rations, the food keeping their people alive after the destruction of the buffalo would be cut off. Facing mass starvation, the agency chiefs, who represented the defeated and reservation-bound portion of the nation, signed under extreme duress. It was a coercive agreement of dubious legality, a fact the US Supreme Court would acknowledge over a century later, calling it a taking worthy of compensation. But in 1877 it was the final paper-thin veneer of legality placed over a conquest achieved by winter war and starvation. The Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho peoples were now confined to reservations, primarily the Great Sioux Reservation, broken into smaller agencies like Standing Rock, Cheyenne River, Pine Ridge, and Rosebud. Life there was a profound culture shock, designed to eradicate the old ways and assimilate them into American society. The government, through agents and missionaries, implemented a policy of civilization. This meant cutting men's long hair, replacing traditional dress with trousers and dresses, suppressing native religions and languages, and forcing children into boarding schools where they were punished for speaking their mother tongue. The warrior became a farmer on land often unsuitable for agriculture. The complex mobile social structure of the Teospaye was suppressed in favor of a sedentary, nuclear family model imposed by government agents. The spiritual connection to the land was severed by fences and boundaries. For the individuals who had shaped the battle, the decades that followed were an often bleak coda. Sitting Bull, after 2 years as a prisoner of war at Fort Randall, was allowed to settle at Standing Rock. He never accepted the new order. He briefly travelled with Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, a spectacle that used him as a living artifact of a vanquished foe, which he endured to earn money for his people. He remained a vocal critic of the Dawes Act, which aimed to break up tribal lands into individual allotments, and was seen as a dangerous influence by the agents. In December 1890, during the tension surrounding the Ghost Dance movement, a spiritual revival that promised the return of the buffalo and the disappearance of the whites, Indian police were sent to arrest him. A struggle ensued, and he was shot and killed. His death at the hands of his own people, coerced into serving the government, was a tragic symbol of the division and despair colonization had wrought. The battlefield of the Little Bighorn became, in 1879, a national cemetery, and in 1886 the Custer Battlefield National Monument. For generations, it was curated as a shrine to American military sacrifice. The Park Service markers traced Custer's last stand. The museum displayed soldiers' artifacts. The native side of the story was absent, or presented only as the faceless antagonist. It was a landscape of memory, but a deliberately one-sided one. The enduring significance of the event as the 19th century closed was clear in the American mind. It was the last dramatic gasp of savage resistance, a tragic but necessary episode in the triumphant story of westward expansion. The complexity, the broken treaties, the righteous defense, the strategic brilliance of the victors, all were smoothed into a simple, morally clear fable of civilization versus savagery. The true legacy of profound historical trauma, of a theft cemented by force, of cultural devastation, lay buried, like the bones periodically unearthed by erosion on that wind-swept hill, waiting for a future generation to examine them with clearer eyes. The battle was over, but the long struggle over its meaning had just begun. The closing decades of the 19th century saw the story of the Little Bighorn solidify into national myth, a process as deliberate and forceful as the military campaigns that had followed the battle itself. The narrative became a tool wielded to justify the completed conquest of the West and to define the character of the nation that had emerged from it. In this refined myth, complexity was the enemy. The battle was distilled into a powerful, simplistic allegory. Civilization, represented by the stalwart blue-clad soldier, confronted savagery, embodied by the howling, faceless Indian horde. The soldier, though defeated, died a hero's death, his sacrifice paving the way for the inevitable triumph of progress. This allegory was propagated through every available medium. Dime novels, like those in the Deadwood Dick series, sensationalized Custer's last moments. Stage plays and early Wild West shows, most notably Buffalo Bill Cody's spectacular touring production, offered reenactments that thrilled audiences with staged cavalry charges and whooping Indians, always culminating in the pathos of the last stand. Cody, who had served as a scout in the wars and famously claimed to have taken the first scalp for Custer, understood the potent entertainment value of the tale, even as he employed former foes like Sitting, Bull in his cast. This myth-making served a critical psychological function for a nation undergoing rapid, disorienting industrialization and urbanization. The frontier, declared officially closed by the census of 1890, was transformed in the popular imagination from a messy, violent contest over land and resources into a romantic arena where quintessential American virtues, courage, individualism, endurance, were tested and proven. Custer, refashioned as the flawless knight of the plains, became a usable hero for a country seeking foundational legends. His defeat was more compelling than a victory might have been. It contained the poignant element of martyrdom, which allowed for mourning without guilt. The myth effectively absolved the nation of any moral ambiguity surrounding the dispossession of native peoples. By framing the conflict as a tragic but inevitable clash between advanced and primitive worlds, it rendered the outcome, confinement, cultural destruction, land, seizure, as the natural if somber course of history. Concurrently, the living participants in the battle, particularly on the native side, were systematically transformed into artifacts or silenced. Sitting Bull's stint with Buffalo Bill's Wild West in 1885 was a stark example. Audiences paid to see the vicious savage who had killed Custer, but they saw instead a quiet, dignified man who signed autographs for a fee, which he gave to the poor. The performance neutralized him, turning a profound political and spiritual leader into a carnival attraction, a relic of a conquered past. Other veterans of the fight found themselves confined to reservations, their stories of victory dismissed as boasts or ignored entirely by the agents and ethnographers who now documented a dying culture. The official channels of history, government reports, regimental histories, early academic works, either omitted their perspectives or filtered them through a lens of presumed barbarism. The native account became not a competing history, but folklore, not testimony, but legend. On the ground, the battlefield itself was curated to enshrine the myth. The 7th Cavalry dead were reinterred, and in 1881 a granite obelisk was erected on Last Stand Hill, listing the names of the soldiers who fell with Custer. White marble headstones were placed where men were believed to have died, dotting the ridges with silent, orderly witness to the Army's version of events. The National Cemetery established there became a place of pilgrimage for veterans, patriots, and tourists. The landscape was managed to tell one story, of military sacrifice. The immense village site, the fords used by crazy horses flanking movement, the routes of the warriors, these were unmarked, invisible to the visitor. The park, under War Department and later National Park Service management, was a memorial to a defeat, but a defeat that had been successfully reframed as a heroic episode in a larger, victorious national saga. The victors, in a profound irony, were erased from their own field of victory, their presence only implied by the scattering of white markers that recorded their triumphant lethality. While the public myth congealed, a quieter, more persistent counter-narrative was preserved in the lodges and family circles of the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho people. Suppressed in the public sphere, the memory of the Greasy Grass lived on as a vibrant, detailed oral history. These were not merely tales of battle, they were narratives of identity, resistance, and spiritual truth, passed down with the meticulous care reserved for the most important events. Elders who had been there, warriors like Iron Hawk, Two Moons, and Moving Robe Woman, shared their experiences with children and grandchildren, ensuring the story remained a living tissue connecting generations to a time of power and autonomy. These accounts presented a radically different reality from the monolithic Last Stand. They were specific, personal, and often tactical. Warriors spoke of counting coup on a soldier with a spotted horse, of the panic in the cavalry's eyes during Reno's retreat, of the dust and confusion, of the precise moment Crazy Horse's men crossed the river. They named names, described deeds, and located actions in specific coulees and ridges. The battle was not a single heroic act, but a complex mosaic of individual and group actions. Crucially, these stories were embedded within a moral and spiritual framework. The victory was understood as a fulfillment of Sitting Bull's sun dance vision, a divine endorsement of their cause. It was a defense of home and family, a righteous response to the invasion of the Black Hills. In these tellings, Custer was not a martyred hero, but an arrogant aggressor whose Wasichu pride led him to destruction. The early 20th century saw the first tentative efforts by a handful of white ethnographers and historians to document these perspectives. Pioneering figures like Walter M. Camp interviewed native veterans and 7th Cavalry survivors alike, collecting fragments of testimony. Even more significant was the work of men like John G. Neihart, who in 1931 published Black Elk Speaks, the profound spiritual autobiography of an Oglala holy man who had fought as a teenager at the Little Bighorn. Black Elk's narrative wove the battle into a grander tapestry of Lakota cosmology and loss. I can still see the butchered women and children lying heaped and scattered all along the crooked gulch, and I can see that something else died there in the bloody mud and was buried in the blizzard. A people's dream died there. His words framed the victory not as a beginning, but as a high water mark, after which the dream of a free life ebbed away. Simultaneously, a more critical, though still marginal military analysis began to emerge. Writers and retired officers started to pick apart the tactical decisions, moving beyond the simple massacre trope. Questions about Custer's division of the regiment, Reno's retreat, Benteen's delay, and the role of the pack train entered serious discourse. This analysis was still largely confined to military journals and academic circles, but it represented a crack in the monolithic myth. It treated the battle as a military event with causes and effects rather than a moral fable. It reluctantly began to grant the Lakota and Cheyenne a degree of agency and tactical sophistication, if only to better understand how they had achieved such a complete victory. These twin streams, oral tradition from the native side and critical military history from the white side, flowed underground for decades, challenging the official story but unable to dislodge it from its central place in the popular imagination. The battle's history was becoming a dialogue, though one partner in that dialogue still spoke in a whisper the broader culture was not yet ready to hear. The mid-20th century witnessed the gradual, often contentious emergence of the Little Bighorn from myth into the realm of forensic history and public controversy. The catalyst was often archaeological and anthropological investigation, which brought a new physical language to the debate. In 1958, a grass fire swept across the battlefield, burning away the dense ground cover and revealing a trove of metal artifacts, cartridge cases, bullets, arrowheads, uniform buttons. This event prompted the first systematic archaeological survey. By mapping the precise locations of spent shells, historians like Dr. John Gray began to reconstruct the flow of the battle with scientific precision. The pattern of 45-55 cartridge cases from cavalry carbines and 44 Henry casings from native rifles told a story of positions, movements, and lines of fire. The evidence on the ground began to contradict the romantic image of a single, static last stand. It suggested a fighting retreat, with skirmish lines collapsing back toward the hill and intense fighting in the ravines where the mythology had placed no action. This scientific approach coincided with and fueled a broader cultural shift during the Civil Rights era and the rise of the American Indian Movement, AIM. A new generation of historians, influenced by ethnohistory, actively sought out native sources and placed them on equal footing with military documents. Books like Evan S. Connell's Son of the Morning Star, 1984, wove together these disparate threads, military reports, oral histories, archaeological data, into a rich, ambiguous, and deeply human tapestry. Connell's work, a bestseller, did not offer easy heroes or villains. It presented a tragic collision of flawed men and irreconcilable worlds. It brought the complexity long known to scholars into the living rooms of the general public. The battlefield itself became the stage for a direct confrontation over memory. For decades, the only monument was the granite obelisk to the 7th Cavalry. Native visitors coming to honor their own ancestors found a landscape that commemorated only their enemies. This was a profound insult, a continuation of the erasure that had followed the military defeat. Beginning in the 1980s, led by activists like AIM member Russell Means and traditional elders, a movement grew to erect a counter-monument. The demand was for a memorial to the native warriors and the indigenous way of life they died defending. The proposal met with fierce resistance from some veterans groups and traditionalists who saw it as desecrating a military cemetery. The debate was heated, emotional, and deeply symbolic. Who had the right to interpret this ground? Was it solely a gravesite for US soldiers, or was it also a sacred site of native victory and sacrifice? The controversy laid bare the unresolved wounds of the American past. It was no longer just about 1876, it was about the subsequent century of silence and misrepresentation. The National Park Service managing the site found itself in an impossible position, caught between two powerful, grieving constituencies. Public hearings were charged with emotion. Native testimony spoke of spiritual connection and historical erasure. Descendants of cavalrymen and Custer buffs spoke of honoring the dead and preserving tradition. It was a microcosm of the nation's struggle to come to terms with its colonial history. The battlefield was no longer a quiet, settled shrine. It had become the most active front in the ongoing war for the story of the American West, a war waged not with bullets but with narratives, symbols, and the power to control memory. The slow, grinding process of reconciliation and reinterpretation culminated in two landmark events in the 1990s that formally reshaped the physical and legal legacy of the battle. The first was the dramatic change to the battlefield landscape itself. After over a decade of debate, compromise was reached. In 1991, the US Congress passed legislation authorizing the creation of a memorial to the Native American participants. The design process was inclusive, involving tribal representatives, historians, and artists. The result, dedicated in 2003, is a powerful circular earthwork nestled into a hillside near the Reno-Benteen Defense Site, known as the Indian Memorial. Its central theme is peace through unity. A circular open-walled structure invites the visitor inside, where a spirit gate frames the distant 7th Cavalry obelisk, symbolically linking the two memories. Bronze sculptures of Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors and women are integrated into the walls, and inscriptions in multiple native languages commemorate the victory as an act of defense. Most poignantly, the names of the native combatants known to have died in the battle are etched in stone, granting them the same individual recognition long afforded the soldiers. This architectural dialogue was paralleled by a profound shift in the site's very name. In 1991, after persistent lobbying by native groups and their allies, the US government officially renamed the site. Custer Battlefield National Monument was stricken from the maps. The new name, Little Bighorn Battlefield National Monument, was a subtle but seismic change. It shifted the focus from a single man and his fate to the location itself and the totality of the event that occurred there. It was an act of historical recentering, acknowledging that the story belonged to all who fought, not just to the defeated commander. On the ground, red granite markers began to be placed at locations where native warriors were believed to have fallen, mirroring the white marble markers of the cavalry. The landscape now tells a dialogic story. The visitor is confronted with two sets of markers, two memorials, two histories sharing the same ground. The second landmark event occurred in the realm of law and reparations. The illegal seizure of the Black Hills, the casus belli for the Great Sioux War, had never been legally resolved. The tribes had never accepted the Sell or Starve Agreement of 1877. In 1923, they had first sued the federal government for the theft. After decades of legal wrangling, the U.S. Court of Claims in 1979 and ultimately the U.S. Supreme Court in 1980, United States versus Sioux Nation of Indians, ruled unequivocally in the Sioux's favor. The court called the government's conduct a more ripe and rank case of dishonorable dealings will never, in all probability, be found in our history. It affirmed that the Black Hills had been taken illegally and awarded financial compensation, the initial value of the land in 1877 plus over a century of interest, which by the 1980s had ballooned to over $100 million. Yet, in a stunning act of principle, the Sioux nations, led by the traditional chiefs and activists, refused the money. The hills, they insisted, were not for sale. They could not be bought and sold. They demanded the return of the land itself. The money sits in a trust account, accumulating interest, a testament not to a settled debt, but to an ongoing, unresolved injustice. This legal victory affirmed the moral basis of the native cause in a forum even the American myth could not ignore, tying the battle directly to a contemporary political and spiritual claim that remains vibrantly alive. The story of the Little Bighorn in the modern era is no longer a settled myth but an ongoing conversation, a prism through which fundamental questions about American history, memory, and identity are refracted. The battlefield today is a place of powerful, sometimes uncomfortable juxtaposition. Tourists walk a landscape dotted with white markers for Custer's men and red markers for native warriors. They can visit the 7th Cavalry obelisk, then walk to the serene, contemplative space of the Indian Memorial. Park rangers who once solely recounted troop movements now must be conversant in Lakota spirituality, Cheyenne society, and the nuances of 19th century federal Indian policy. The narrative presented is one of clashing cultures, an attempt to hold two truths in tension without simplifying either. Scholarship continues to evolve, incorporating new methodologies and perspectives. Forensic anthropology has revisited the skeletal remains, offering insights into the health, age, and even the specific wounds of the combatants. LiDAR and other remote sensing technologies map the terrain with impossible precision, allowing for ever more detailed analysis of sight lines and movements. Each new piece of evidence subtly adjusts the picture, chipping away at final certainties. The debate is alive. Was there a coordinated last stand, or a series of fragmented collapses? How much responsibility lies with Reno, with Benteen, with Terry's ambiguous orders? The battle has become a historian's laboratory, its every minute, dissected with a scrutiny afforded to few other events. For the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho people, the battle remains a living presence. It is commemorated not as a distant historical event, but as a chapter in an ongoing story of survival and resistance. Annual gatherings such as the Bighorn Days powwow and ceremonies held near the battlefield are acts of remembrance and cultural renewal. Elders bring youth to the site, not to glorify war, but to teach the values of courage, unity, and defense of homeland that their ancestors embodied there. The victory is a source of enduring pride, a proof of capability and spirit in the face of overwhelming force. Yet it is inextricably linked to the subsequent tragedy, the loss of the hills, the years of suffering on reservations, the struggles of the present. The battle is a bittersweet pinnacle, a moment of light that makes the surrounding darkness more profound. In the broader American consciousness, the Battle of the Little, Bighorn has lost its tidy moral clarity. It can no longer be comfortably framed as a simple tragedy of noble sacrifice. It forces a confrontation with the less heroic aspects of national expansion, broken treaties, cultural arrogance, and the use of overwhelming force to resolve political disputes. Custer himself has been demythologized, transformed from marble hero into a complex, flawed, and fascinating figure, a symbol of both American audacity and its fatal overreach. The battle serves as a permanent cautionary tale about the perils of underestimating an opponent, the fragility of reputation, and the unpredictable consequences of pride. Ultimately, the enduring significance of the Little Bighorn lies in its irreducible complexity. It was at once a tactical masterpiece for one side and a catastrophic blunder for the other, a spiritual confirmation and a political disaster, a moment of supreme native power that catalyzed their ultimate subjugation. It is a story that refuses to be pinned down, a historical vortex that continues to draw in questions of memory, justice, and national identity. The battlefield, with its dual markers and competing memorials, stands as a metaphor for the American experience itself, a nation built on contested ground, its history a palimpsest of triumph and tragedy, heroism and horror, waiting for each generation to read it anew, and to find within it not a single truth, but the challenging, necessary dialogue between many. The Battle of the Little Bighorn endures not merely as an event in history, but as a profound paradox lodged in the heart of the American narrative. It represents a peak of Native American military and political power, achieved at the very moment the material and demographic foundations of that power were being systematically annihilated. It was a decisive tactical victory that ensured a catastrophic strategic defeat. This central contradiction gives the event its enduring, tragic resonance. For the Lakota and Cheyenne, the summer of 1876 was the apex of their resistance, a proof of their capacity to organize, unite, and defend their world against the most formidable army on the continent. Yet, that very success triggered a response so total, so ruthless in its application of industrial age logic against a pastoral society, that recovery became impossible. The victory proved they could win a battle, but it also revealed to the United States that it was losing a war of a kind it was not prepared to fight, a war of mobility and spiritual commitment, thereby forcing a change in strategy to one of environmental and economic siege against which there was no defense. This paradox extends to the character of the battle's most famous casualty. George Armstrong Custer sought immortality through action, and in this he succeeded beyond his grandest dreams, though not in the manner he intended. His death on that hill guaranteed his name would outlive those of his superiors, Grant, Sheridan, and Terry. He achieved the eternal fame he craved, but as a symbol of defeat, not victory, as a subject of controversy, not unanimous acclaim. He became a fixture in the national imagination, yet each generation has reconstructed him to serve its own needs. The Gilded Age's martyred knight, the Progressive era's flawed hero, the post-Vietnam era's emblem of arrogant imperialism. His legacy is a palimpsest, endlessly rewritten. The man who lived by the headlines was ultimately consumed by them, transformed from a complex human being into an icon onto which Americans could project their own evolving anxieties about power, race, and national destiny. Similarly, the battlefield itself is a geographical paradox. It is a site of triumph for one people and a site of mourning for another, a rare piece of earth where the victors and the vanquished in a continental struggle share the same sacred ground. This commingling of opposed memories makes it uniquely powerful and uniquely uncomfortable. It is not a monument to a concluded event, but a theatre where the drama of interpretation continues to be performed. The wind that sweeps across Last Stand Hill carries not just the whispers of the dead, but the echoes of ongoing debates about law, sovereignty, and historical justice. The very soil seems to reject a single settled story. Archaeological remains surface to challenge long-held assumptions. A new oral history from a Lakota family can reorient the understanding of a ravine's significance. The land itself is an active participant in the historical dialogue, refusing to be silent. The battle also stands as a stark lesson in the failure of imagination. Custer could not imagine a native force capable of defeating the 7th Cavalry in open combat. The War Department could not imagine the scale and cohesion of the gathering on the greasy grass. Conversely, while Sitting Bull could imagine through spiritual vision the defeat of the soldiers even he might have, struggled to imagine the totality of the vengeance that would follow, the industrial will that would not accept a reversal, the society that could lose a battle but never conceive of losing the war. Both sides were trapped in their own cultural certainties, unable to accurately model the other's responses. This failure of imagination is the engine of tragedy in history. It leads to miscalculated risks, underestimated resolve, and the terrible surprise when the world refuses to conform to one's own narrative of how it should work. The Little Bighorn is a masterclass in this fatal dynamic, where two colliding worldviews produced a shock that neither fully comprehended, even in the moment of impact. The long-term impact of the Battle of the Little Bighorn on the native nations involved was both immediate and generational, a seismic shock that rearranged the tectonic plates of their existence. In the short term, the victory provided a potent, if fleeting, sense of invincibility and unity. But as the winter campaigns unfolded, that unity fractured under the pressure of starvation and military pursuit. The surrender of the great leaders and the confinement to reservations did not merely end a way of life. It initiated a century of profound trauma, policy-driven assimilation, and cultural struggle. The people who'd been mobile and self-sufficient became dependent on government rations, which were often inadequate or stolen by corrupt agents. The spiritual practices that had sustained them, like the sun dance, were outlawed. Children were taken to boarding schools in a deliberate campaign of cultural genocide aimed at killing the Indian to save the man. Within this context, the memory of the Little Bighorn became a crucial resource for survival. It was a wellspring of pride and identity in a world designed to induce shame and erase heritage. The stories of courage, of Crazy Horse's tactical genius, of Sitting Bull's prophecy, were told not as nostalgia for a lost past, but as evidence of inherent strength in the righteousness of their cause. The battle proved they were not a primitive people passively yielding to a superior force, but a formidable nation that had fought for its freedom and won a great field. This memory became a shield against the narrative of their own inferiority and vanishing that was prevalent in white American culture. It fostered resilience. The knowledge that their ancestors had faced the full might of the US Army and triumphed provided a psychological backbone for surviving the trials of reservation life, the loss of the Black Hills, and the challenges of the 20th century. For the United States, the long-term impact was on the national psyche and the mechanics of empire. The Custer massacre myth served to justify the final, brutal phase of continental conquest. It provided an emotionally satisfying reason to unleash overwhelming force, framing it not as aggression but as rightful retribution and necessary pacification. The battle accelerated the shift from a policy of treaty-making, however flawed, to one of direct control and coercion. The era of recognizing native nations as sovereign entities with whom one negotiated ended with the Great Sioux War. What followed was the era of the Dawes Act, allotment and boarding schools, policies of internal colonization aimed at dissolving tribal identity and absorbing individuals into the American body politic. Yet, the battle also left a permanent scar of doubt on the myth of invincible progress. Custer's defeat was an unnerving reminder of the potential for chaos, for the plan to go disastrously wrong. It injected a note of tragedy and uncertainty into the triumphalist saga of manifest destiny. This is why the story held such fascination. It was the nightmare counterpoint to the dream of orderly expansion. The image of the last stand, for all its fictional gloss, touched a deep nerve about sacrifice, isolation, and the price of empire. It complicated the national story, forcing a space for a tale of loss amidst the chronicles of gain. In this way, the battle became an integral part of American mythology, not in spite of its outcome, but because of it. A clean, unbroken narrative of success is less compelling, less human, than one punctuated by dramatic, instructive failure. The Little Bighorn provided that necessary punctuation, a grim comma in the long sentence of westward movement. The principal characters of the drama, stripped of their later mythologies, confront us as human beings whose actions under extreme pressure created a historical vortex. George Armstrong Custer's final hours were likely a rapid, brutal education in the limits of his own understanding. The man who believed in the decisive cavalry charge, in the power of individual gallantry, and in the inherent disorganization of his foe, found himself trapped in a form of warfare for which his experience had not prepared him. His decisions to attack, to divide his command, were logical within his frame of reference, but his frame of reference was fatally flawed. In the end, he was not the orchestrator of a last stand, but the commander of a collapse. His story is a classical tragedy of hubris, but also a very American tragedy of ambition hurtling into the unforgiving reality of a wider world. Sitting Bull, in contrast, spent his final years as a prisoner of the victory he had helped engineer. His authority, which peaked in the Great Gathering, was unsustainable in the world of reservations and government agents. He became a symbol of resistance in a context where armed resistance was futile, a leader without a domain. His death in 1890, killed by Indian police during the panic over the ghost dance, was the bitter epilogue. He was eliminated not by the army he had defeated, but by the internal divisions and colonial bureaucracy that victory had made inevitable. His legacy is one of unyielding spiritual and political integrity, a commitment to his people's sovereignty that never wavered, even when the practical means to exercise it had vanished. Crazy Horse presents the most enigmatic and poignant figure. His genius was tactical, not political. His power was personal, not institutional. He fought to protect, not to conquer. After surrender, he found himself in a world he could not navigate, where his very presence was a threat to the fragile, imposed order. His killing was less an assassination than a systemic failure, the machinery of control unable to process a man who operated on a different moral and cultural logic. He remains the purest symbol of the free Lakota spirit, uncommodified, unreconstructed, forever elusive to the camera or the biographer's full comprehension. For the common soldiers of the 7th Cavalry and the warriors in the village, the battle was a transformative, often brutalizing, personal event. The cavalryman, perhaps an Irish immigrant or a farm boy from Ohio, faced a terror and a violence for which no training could prepare him. His death, if he died on the hill, was anonymous and gruesome. His survival, if he made it to the bluffs, was a trauma he carried in silence. The Lakota or Cheyenne warrior fought with the immediacy of defending his family, his home, his way of life. His experience was one of adrenaline, purpose, and then, for the survivors, the long aftermath of displacement and loss. For both, the battle was a hinge in their personal histories, a before and after that defined the rest of their days. Their individual courage, fear, and suffering are the human substrate of the grand historical themes, reminders that history is ultimately the sum of countless personal destinies colliding. The Battle of the Little Bighorn, removed from its specific time and place, ascends to the level of archetype. It joins a global repertoire of storied last stands, Thermopylae, the Alamo, Isandlwana, where a surrounded force fights to the end against overwhelming odds. These stories resonate across cultures because they speak to universal human themes: sacrifice, honor, the struggle against inevitable doom. The Custer myth tapped directly into this archetype, which explains its powerful and enduring grip on the imagination, even as the historical facts have been revised. The image of the last circle of defenders, backs to each other, making their final choice, is a primal scene of tragic heroism. But the battle is also an archetype of something darker, the fatal clash of expanding and traditional societies. It is a case study in the violence that erupts when a technologically advanced, demographically swelling civilization encounters a peoples whose way of life is rooted in a specific geography and a different relationship to the land. This pattern is not unique to the American West. It is the story of the Roman frontier, the Zulu War, the colonization of the steppes. The Little Bighorn offers a particularly clear and dramatic snapshot of this moment of collision, where the traditional society achieves its greatest military success, just as the wheels of its ultimate destruction are already in irreversible motion. It is an archetype of the Pyrrhic victory. In American culture, the battle has been a versatile symbol, constantly repurposed. In the late 19th century, it was a call to arms and a justification for conquest. By the mid-20th century, in films like They Died with Their Boots On, 1941, it was a stirring, patriotic melodrama. In the post-Vietnam era, with films like Little Big Man, 1970, the narrative inverted, with Custer becoming a crazed megalomaniac and the Native Americans the sympathetic victims of genocide. This shift reflected a national loss of innocence, a new willingness to question foundational myths. The battle became a lens for critiquing American imperialism and militarism. Today, the archetype speaks to ongoing struggles over memory, justice, and reconciliation. The debates about monuments, the legal fight for the Black Hills, the efforts at the battlefield itself to tell a more inclusive story, all are contemporary enactments of the battle's unresolved tensions. It is no longer just a story about 1876. It is a metaphor for how a multicultural nation contends with the painful chapters of its birth. The battle forces the question, can a shared history be built from the fragments of opposing experiences? Can a landscape of conflict become a place of shared understanding? The ongoing effort to answer these questions at the Little Bighorn makes it a living archetype of America's attempt to come to terms with itself. As the long shadows of a summer evening stretch across the greasy grass, the battlefield settles into a silence that feels less like emptiness and more like a held breath. This is not a quiet that concludes, but one that listens. The story of the Little Bighorn resists closure because it is not a single story with a moral, but a knot of narratives pulled tight by history, each strand representing a different truth, a different loss, a different claim on this piece of earth. The enduring significance of the battle lies precisely in this refusal to be simplified. It denies us the comfort of easy heroes and clear villains. It forces us to sit with ambiguity, to acknowledge the courage of the 7th Cavalry trooper while recognizing he was an instrument of conquest, to honor the martial brilliance of Crazy Horse while mourning the catastrophic reaction it provoked, to understand Custer's ambition without absolving his fatal miscalculations. This complexity is its great gift to history. It teaches that events of such magnitude are not puzzles to be solved, but realities to be continually revisited, each generation bringing its own questions and its own conscience to the examination. The battlefield today is a testament to this evolving consciousness. The paired memorials, the white obelisk and the earthwork, circle, do not cancel each other out. They exist in a tense, necessary dialogue. One speaks of duty and sacrifice within a military tradition. The other speaks of homeland, spirit, and resistance within a living culture. To walk from one to the other is to traverse not just space but perspective. It is an exercise in historical empathy, challenging the visitor to hold two fundamentally different experiences of the same afternoon in their mind simultaneously. This is the hard, essential work of history, not to choose one truth but to comprehend the conditions that made both truths possible. For the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho, the Greasy Grass is more than a historic site. It is a place where the why, the sun, still shines on the deeds of their grandfathers. It is a source of strength and a reminder of responsibility. The victory conferred an obligation to remember, to honor, and to continue the struggle for sovereignty and cultural integrity in new arenas, courtrooms, schools, and the realm of public memory. The battle is not a relic, but a chapter in an ongoing story of survival. Ultimately, the Battle of the Little Bighorn endures because it is a mirror. We see in it our own preoccupations, with heroism and failure, with expansion and its costs, with how we remember and what we choose to forget. It reflects America's persistent struggle to reconcile its founding ideals of liberty with the often brutal mechanics of its growth. The wind that sweeps the ridges seems to ask not what happened here, but what does it mean? And the answer is never static. It changes with the times, with the scholarship, with the voices we finally choose to hear. So the story continues. It is written in the solemn faces of visitors reading the new interpretive signs, in the prayers of native families leaving offerings of cloth and tobacco at the Indian memorial, in the quiet reckonings of historians sifting through the evidence. The battle is over, but its echoes are perpetual. They resonate in the unresolved claim to the Black Hills, in the search for a more honest national history, and in the silent shared space of that Montana valley where two worlds met in a flash of violence, and where perhaps the long, slow work of understanding finally began.